The morning light filtered through the blinds of the penthouse suite, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Alexander Green stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city awakening 40 floors below. His reflection stared back at him, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of boardrooms and not enough of life. "Will you be needing the car today, sir?" His assistant Thomas asked from the doorway, tablet in hand. Alexander shook his head without turning around. "No, I think I'll walk today." Thomas paused, his finger hovering over the schedule displayed on his tablet. "But sir, you have the investors' meeting at 11. Cancel it." Alexander's voice was soft but firm. "Reschedule for next week. Tell them I'm indisposed." Thomas knew better than to argue. In the 2 years since Elizabeth had passed, his boss had become increasingly unpredictable. The business world called it eccentric behavior. The tabloids called it a billionaire's midlife crisis. But Thomas, who had worked for Alexander for 15 years, recognized it for what it was, grief finding its way out in strange, unpredictable bursts. "Very well. Sir," Thomas said, backing out of the room, "will you be taking your phone?" Alexander patted his pocket and felt the sleek device. "Yes, but don't expect me to answer it." When the door closed, Alexander moved to his closet, a room larger than most people's apartments. He bypassed the tailored suits and designer clothes, reaching instead for the items stored in a plain wooden chest at the back. From it, he pulled faded jeans, a worn navy sweater with frayed cuffs, scuffed work boots, and a baseball cap for the local team. His disguise. The first time he'd gone out like this had been an accident. 6 months after Elizabeth's funeral, he'd been too tired to change after volunteering at her favorite homeless shelter, something he'd started doing to feel closer to her memory. Walking home in regular clothes, no one had recognized him. No one had asked for money or investment tips or tried to pitch him business ideas. For the first time in decades, he had been invisible, and it had felt like freedom. Now these walks had become his escape. Once or twice a week, he would transform himself from Alexander Green, tech billionaire worth $7.3 billion according to last month's Forbes, into just another face in the crowd. Just a man. Nobody. As he changed clothes, his eyes drifted to the grand piano in the corner of his bedroom, black and glossy and untouched except by the housekeeper's dusting cloth. Elizabeth had insisted on keeping it there even when he'd stopped playing. "One day you'll come back to it," she'd said. "Music isn't something you can just cut out of yourself." But he had cut it out, or tried to. The piano was just furniture now, a painful reminder of roads not taken. Alexander pulled the baseball cap low over his eyes and took the service elevator down to avoid the building staff. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, the city streets already bustling. He walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, his gait less confident than his boardroom stride. Amazing how body language could transform a person. He stopped at a coffee cart waiting in line like everyone else. The vendor, a heavy-set man with a thick accent, didn't give him a second glance as he handed over a black coffee in exchange for crumpled bills from Alexander's pocket. "Thanks," Alexander said, and meant it. The coffee wasn't as good as the custom roasted beans his chef prepared each morning, but somehow it tasted better. He wandered without destination, something he never did in his real life. His real life was scheduled down to the minute, meetings and calls and decisions worth millions of dollars. But today he was just a man drinking coffee, watching the city move around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Thomas, no doubt, with some crisis that needed immediate attention. The company's new software platform was launching next month, and the stress levels at the office were through the roof. He should care more. He should be there, leading, deciding. But lately it all seemed so pointless. Elizabeth would have understood this feeling. She'd been the one who kept him grounded, who reminded him there was a world outside profit margins and market share. They'd met in college. Him studying business on his way up from a middle-class childhood. Her in pre-med with dreams of helping others. She'd been the smart one, the kind one, the one who saw through his ambition to the scared boy underneath who just wanted to prove himself. On their third date, he'd taken her to a practice room in the music building. He'd been studying piano since he was 6, but few people knew about his talent. He'd played for her, Chopin her favorite, and she'd looked at him with those clear blue eyes. "That's who you really are," she'd said. "Not the business major who answers every question first. "This is you." She'd been right, of course. She usually was. But somewhere along the way, as green tech grew from a startup in his garage to a multinational corporation, the music had faded away. There were always more important things to do. Always another deal, another acquisition, another milestone. Elizabeth had kept playing, though. Their home had always been filled with music. Her amateur but enthusiastic renditions of classical pieces, the children's recitals, the parties where eventually she'd coax him to the bench for a duet, his fingers remembering what his mind tried to forget. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4, they said. Terminal. 18 months of watching her fade, note by note, until the house fell silent. Alexander stopped walking, suddenly aware he'd wandered farther than usual. He was downtown now, near the train station. The crowd had thickened, people rushing to jobs or appointments or whatever urgency pulled at their lives. No one noticed the billionaire in their midst, and the anonymity wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. A street musician played guitar on the corner, case open for tips. Alexander dropped a 20 in it as he passed. The young man nodded thanks without interrupting his song. What would it be like, Alexander wondered, to make music again? To create something that wasn't measured in stock prices or market share? His coffee had gone cold, but he sipped it anyway as he approached the grand old train station. He hadn't been inside for years. Private cars and helicopters and jets had replaced public transportation in his world long ago. But something about the building's solid presence, its endurance through decades of the city's evolution, drew him in today. The station's massive interior opened up before him, soaring ceilings, the famous clock, the constellations painted in gold against blue. People flowed around him like a river parting around a stone. Announcements echoed overhead, footsteps clattered. 1,000 private conversations created a gentle roar of humanity. Alexander stood still, absorbing it all. This was what he'd been missing in his tower above the city. This messy, unpredictable, beautiful chaos of ordinary life. Elizabeth would have loved this moment, would have pointed out the small human dramas unfolding around them. The tearful goodbyes, joyful reunions, impatient commuters, daydreaming travelers. He felt a drop of water hit his cheek and realized the station's roof must be leaking from the morning's rain. But when he reached up, his fingers came away wet with tears. He hadn't realized he was crying. "You okay, mister?" A child's voice startled him. A small boy with curious eyes looked up at him, clutching his mother's hand. "Tommy, don't bother people," the mother said, tugging the boy away with an apologetic smile. "I'm fine," Alexander said, but they were already gone, swallowed by the crowd. Was he fine? He didn't know anymore. In the 2 years since Elizabeth's death, he'd functioned. He'd run the company. He'd attended the galas and signed the checks for the foundations they'd started together. He'd even started dating again recently, a woman his board member had introduced him to, elegant and accomplished and completely wrong for him, but he wasn't living. Not really, and somewhere deep inside where the music used to live, he knew Elizabeth would have been disappointed in what he'd become. Alexander wandered deeper into the station, away from the main concourse where most of the crowds gathered. In a quieter corner, something caught his eye. An upright piano, slightly battered but dignified. A small sign propped against it read, "Play Me." His feet carried him toward it without conscious decision. The bench was empty, waiting. His fingers, which now spent their days signing documents and tapping on screens, twitched with a long-forgotten urge. When was the last time he'd played? Elizabeth's funeral. He'd insisted on performing her favorite piece himself, though his hands had shaken so badly he'd barely made it through. Alexander sat down on the bench. The vinyl was cracked, the piano itself clearly well used. He placed his coffee cup on the floor and flexed his fingers. Just one song, he thought. No one's watching. No one knows who I am. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, and then he began to play. Alexander's fingers hovered above the keys for several heartbeats. The piano was out of tune, he could tell just by looking at it. Nothing like the perfectly maintained concert grand in his penthouse. This was a workhorse of an instrument, weathered by countless hands, battered by the changing seasons in the drafty old station. His first touch was tentative, a simple C major chord. The sound wasn't crisp, but it wasn't terrible either. He played another chord, then another, warming up with the basic scales he'd practiced as a child. A businessman hurried past, briefcase swinging, not even glancing in Alexander's direction. Two teenagers walked by, ears plugged with headphones, lost in their own worlds. No one cared about the middle-aged man in shabby clothes playing scales on a public piano. The anonymity was both comforting and sad. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming against the station's massive windows. The weather had turned the morning commute into a soggy affair. People shook umbrellas, wiped raindrops from their coats, and hurried toward their trains with damp newspapers held over their heads. Alexander hadn't planned to play anything specific, but his hands seemed to have ideas of their own. They moved into a simple tune, something he used to play for the children when they were small. Just a lullaby, nothing fancy. His technique was rusty. He missed a few notes, his timing was off, but it didn't matter. The music flowed through him like water finding a long-forgotten channel. He closed his eyes, letting muscle memory guide him. The lullaby shifted into something more complex. A piece by Bach he'd learned in his second year of lessons. The familiar patterns calmed his racing thoughts, focusing his mind in a way nothing had since Elizabeth died. When was the last time he'd felt this present, this connected to anything? A little girl in a yellow raincoat stopped to watch, clutching her mother's hand. "Mommy, look," she whispered loudly in that way children do. "That man is playing like Miss Chen at school." The mother smiled apologetically at Alexander, clearly expecting him to be annoyed at the interruption. Instead, he nodded at the child and switched to "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." The girl's eyes widened with delight. "That's my song," she exclaimed. "Lily, we need to catch our train," the mother said, tugging her daughter's hand. But they lingered a moment longer as Alexander finished the simple melody, adding a few flourishes at the end that made the little girl giggle. As they walked away, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple joy of making someone else happy through music. It wasn't about impressing anyone or proving his worth. It was just human connection, pure and unfiltered. The clock above showed it was nearly 9. In his other life, he would be sitting in his office by now, reviewing market projections or preparing for the investor meeting he'd canceled. Thomas would have rescheduled it already, making excuses for his boss's absence. The thought should have filled Alexander with guilt, but instead he felt strangely liberated. He began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece Elizabeth had loved. His fingers stumbled at first, searching for notes long unpracticed. But gradually the music began to flow more smoothly, like a stream clearing itself of debris after a long winter. An elderly man stopped several feet away, leaning heavily on his cane. He didn't look directly at Alexander, but tilted his head slightly, listening. A station worker pushing a cart of cleaning supplies slowed as he passed. Two college students paused their animated conversation. Alexander didn't notice his small audience forming. He was lost in the piece now, in memories of playing this same song in their first apartment, a cramped one-bedroom with paper-thin walls, long before the success of Green Tech. Elizabeth would dance around their tiny living room, her medical textbooks momentarily forgotten. "One day," she'd say, spinning in her sock feet, "you'll play on a real stage and I'll be in the front row." But that day never came. His dreams of music had been set aside for more practical pursuits. The startup demanded everything, nights, weekends, holidays. And then the children arrived, wonderful and exhausting, and there were mortgages and school tuitions and 1,000 other reasons to keep pushing toward greater success. The piano became something he played on birthdays and holidays, then only on Christmas, then barely at all. The music swelled beneath his hands. Despite the piano's imperfections, the sound filled the corner of the station where he sat. As he reached the crescendo, his body swayed with the emotion of it, eyes still closed, unaware of the world around him. A woman in a business suit stopped mid-phone call, her conversation forgotten. A group of tourists huddled nearby, whispering and pointing. The cleaning man had stopped completely now, his cart abandoned as he stood transfixed. Alexander's playing wasn't technically perfect. Years without practice had left his skills diminished. But what he lacked in technique he made up for in raw feeling. Each note carried the weight of his grief, his loneliness, his regret for paths not taken. As Clair de Lune came to its gentle conclusion, he opened his eyes, surprised to find nearly 20 people gathered around the piano. They didn't applaud. This wasn't a performance, after all. but several nodded appreciatively. The elderly man with the cane gave a small formal bow, as if acknowledging a fellow musician. Embarrassed by the attention, Alexander started to rise from the bench, but his fingers betrayed him again, finding the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, another of Elizabeth's favorites. He sank back down, surrendering to the music's pull. The rain outside had intensified, turning the morning into a gray blur beyond the windows. Inside, the station hummed with its usual activities. Announcements crackled over the PA system. Trains arrived and departed. People rushed to their destinations. But in this corner, time seemed to slow down. A young woman with a violin case strapped to her back pushed through the small crowd. She watched Alexander's hands with professional interest, her head tilting as she followed the melody. When he fumbled a difficult passage, she smiled sympathetically, the smile of someone who understood the challenge. The crowd grew steadily, people drawn by the unexpected beauty in the midst of their routine day. A mother hushed her fussy toddler, swaying in time to the music. Two construction workers on their way to a job site stood with coffee cups in hand, listening. A group of teenagers put away their phones, momentarily more interested in the live music than their screens. Alexander felt their presence now, but didn't look up. There was something protective about keeping his eyes on the keys, maintaining the bubble of anonymity even as more people gathered. In his regular life, he was used to being watched, his decisions scrutinized by boards and investors, his personal life dissected by business publications. But this was different. These people weren't seeing Alexander Green, CEO. They were just seeing a man playing a piano. As the nocturne ended, there was a brief, expectant silence. Then someone started to clap and others joined in. The applause was scattered and hesitant at first, then more confident. Alexander looked up, startled by the sound and by the size of the crowd, which had grown to at least 40 people. He nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, direct and personal, not filtered through his wealth or position. A young man called out, "Play something else." Several people murmured in agreement. Alexander hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. But the little girl in the yellow raincoat had returned with her mother. They stood at the edge of the crowd, the girl bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Do you take requests?" a voice asked. It was the woman with the violin case. Alexander cleared his throat. "I'm a bit rusty," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud since sitting at the piano. "You sound fine to me," said the elderly man with the cane. "How about some Beethoven?" Beethoven? Alexander hadn't played any Beethoven in years. But before he could respond, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention. A harried-looking security guard pushed through, walkie-talkie in hand. "What's going on here?" he demanded, scanning the gathering. "You can't block the walkway like this." The crowd tensed, ready to disperse. The magic of the moment seemed about to shatter. "He's playing the piano," said the little girl in the yellow raincoat, pointing at Alexander. "And it's beautiful." The guard looked at the piano, then at Alexander with his shabby clothes and 3-day stubble, clearly trying to decide if this was a problem that needed solving. In his other life, Alexander could have ended this confrontation with a word, a flash of his ID, a casual display of power. But here, in his disguise, he was just another potential troublemaker in the station. The woman with the violin stepped forward. "It's the public piano," she said, gesturing to the "Play Me" sign. "That's what it's here for." The guard hesitated, looking at the growing crowd. More people were stopping, curious about the commotion. "Just one more song," the elderly man suggested. "For an old music lover." The security guard's radio crackled. He stepped back, frowning. "Keep the pathway clear," he said finally, "and not too loud." As he moved away, there was a collective breath of relief from the crowd. Alexander looked down at the keys again, considering. Then, with a small smile, he began to play the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The familiar, haunting melody seemed to suspend time in the busy station. The crowd grew silent again, people forgetting for a moment about trains to catch and meetings to attend. Even the guard paused his patrol, listening despite himself. And as the mournful notes echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the grand old station, something shifted inside Alexander, a door long closed beginning finally to reopen. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata flowed from Alexander's fingers like water, gentle, measured and hauntingly beautiful. Each note hung in the air of the station, creating a bubble of stillness that seemed to expand with every passing moment. The crowd had grown to nearly 60 people now, standing in a loose semicircle around the piano. Among them was a businessman who had been rushing to catch the 9:15 train to the financial district. He'd stopped only because the crowd had blocked his path, intending to push through with an irritated "excuse me." But the music had caught him, and now his briefcase rested at his feet, his train forgotten. There was a young mother with twins in a stroller, who had been frazzled and exhausted until the music washed over her, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. An elderly couple held hands, swaying slightly to the melody, transported perhaps to another time, another place. The first movement ended, and in that moment of silence, no one moved. They were waiting, holding their collective breath. Alexander glanced up briefly, surprised again by the size of the gathering. In that quick scan of faces, he saw something that moved him deeply, a shared experience of beauty cutting through the noise and rush of ordinary life. Without preamble, he launched into the second movement, lighter, more delicate. His technique was returning now, muscle memory awakening after its long dormancy. His body remembered what his conscious mind had forgotten: the proper posture, the weight of each finger on the keys, the subtle use of the pedals. A professionally dressed woman near the front of the crowd pulled out her phone and began recording. Others followed suit, blue screens lighting up throughout the audience. In his normal life, Alexander avoided being recorded. His PR team carefully controlled his public image, releasing only approved photos and statements. But here in his disguise, he found he didn't mind. Let them record this moment. It wasn't about him anyway. It was about the music. As the second movement came to its conclusion, Alexander paused, flexing his fingers. They were starting to ache from the unaccustomed exertion. In his younger days, he could play for hours without fatigue, but those days were long past. Still, there was one more movement to go, the third and most demanding part of the sonata. He took a deep breath and began. The third movement was a tempest after the calm, rapid, intense, emotional. His hands flew across the keys, stumbling occasionally on the more difficult passages but recovering quickly. The old piano protested at times, some notes not ringing as clearly as they should. But it held up admirably under his increasingly confident playing. The crowd had grown larger still, people standing on tiptoes at the back to see. The security guard had returned with a colleague, but rather than breaking up the gathering, they were now directing foot traffic around it, creating a space for the impromptu concert to continue. In the midst of the most technically challenging section, Alexander felt something shift within him. The years fell away, and he was 20 again, practicing in the music building late at night, dreaming of concert halls and recordings, before practical concerns had redirected his life. He played now not just with technical skill, but with passion, all the grief and loneliness of the past 2 years pouring through his fingers, transmuted into something beautiful. At the edge of the crowd, a woman in a camel coat stood very still, her eyes fixed on Alexander's face. Patricia Chen, arts reporter for the city's leading newspaper, had been on her way to interview a visiting conductor when the crowd caught her attention. At first, she'd been merely curious, then professionally interested in the spontaneous gathering around a public piano. But as she watched the shabby-looking man play with such unexpected mastery, something tugged at her memory. She moved closer, studying his features. The baseball cap and stubble created an effective disguise, but there was something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the intensity of his concentration. She had interviewed Alexander Green 3 years ago for a piece about wealthy patrons of the arts. He'd mentioned studying piano in his youth but had been dismissive of his own abilities. "Just enough training to know what real talent sounds like," he'd said with a self-deprecating laugh. But this was real talent, or at the very least, the remnants of serious training and innate musicality. Could it possibly be him? The reclusive billionaire whose rare public appearances had grown even rarer since his wife's death, playing a public piano in a train station, dressed like an ordinary commuter. The third movement built toward its climax, Alexander's whole body now involved in the effort, leaning into the fortissimo passages, drawing back for the quieter moments. The little girl in the yellow raincoat had worked her way to the front of the crowd, her face a picture of wonder. The woman with the violin case had closed her eyes, one hand conducting subtly at her side. When the final chords resolved, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, then swelling until it echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the station. Alexander sat motionless, head bowed, hands resting on the keys. The applause washed over him like a wave, and he found himself unable to look up, overcome by emotions he couldn't immediately identify. Gratitude. That was part of it. Gratitude for this moment of connection after so many months of isolation. Relief, too, the relief of expression after long suppression. And something else, a bittersweet realization of all he had given up, all the paths not taken. "Bravo," called the elderly man with the cane, his voice cracking with emotion. "Bravo, maestro." Others joined in with cheers and calls for more. Alexander finally looked up, a shy half-smile on his face. His disguise had protected him from recognition, but it couldn't shield him from the direct impact of these strangers' appreciation. This wasn't about his wealth or position. It wasn't polite applause at a charity function where people clapped because of who he was. This was real. "Another," someone called. "Play something else." Alexander shook his head slightly, feeling suddenly vulnerable. He hadn't played for an audience in decades, and the emotional toll of the Beethoven had left him drained. But as he started to rise from the bench, his eyes met those of the little girl in the yellow raincoat. She was looking at him with such pure hope that he found himself sitting back down. "What would you like to hear?" he asked, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the station. The girl whispered something to her mother, who smiled and nodded toward Alexander. "She's wondering if you know any songs from Frozen," the mother said. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, breaking the intensity of the moment. Alexander grinned, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his face. "I think I can manage that," he said, and began playing a simplified version of "Let It Go." He'd learned it years ago for his niece's birthday, and was surprised to find the melody still in his fingers. The little girl's face lit up with joy. She began to sing along softly, then louder as her mother encouraged her. Soon other children in the crowd joined in, then some of the adults. The impromptu sing-along created a bizarre contrast to the classical piece that had preceded it. But Alexander found himself enjoying it just as much. As he played the final chorus, he caught sight of Thomas pushing through the edge of the crowd, looking harried and confused. His assistant's normally perfect appearance was disheveled, his hair damp from the rain. Their eyes met over the heads of the singing crowd, and Alexander saw the moment of recognition, followed by utter bewilderment. The song ended to more applause and laughter. Before anyone could request another piece, Alexander stood up, nodding his thanks to the crowd. His hands were trembling slightly, though whether from physical exertion or emotion he couldn't tell. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for listening." He made his way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and pats on the back from strangers who had no idea they were touching one of the richest men in the country. As he reached the edge of the gathering, Thomas intercepted him, pulling him aside. "Sir," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "What on earth are you doing? The board is looking for you. There are decisions that need to be made today." Alexander looked back at the piano, now being played by a college student who had stepped up after his departure. The crowd was smaller but still appreciative, the magic of the moment continuing even without him. "How did you find me?" Alexander asked. Thomas held up his phone. "Your security tracker, sir. I was concerned when you didn't answer any calls." Alexander had forgotten about the discreet tracking app installed on his phone, a necessary precaution for someone of his wealth and profile. Another tether to his real life. Patricia Chen was moving toward them, her reporter's instincts clearly triggered by their huddle. "We need to go," Thomas said urgently. "Your car is outside." Alexander hesitated, caught between two worlds. The woman with the violin case was watching him from near the piano, a questioning look on her face. The little girl in the yellow raincoat waved goodbye, her mother leading her toward their delayed train. "Mr. Green," Patricia Chen called, closing the distance between them. "Alexander Green? Is that you?" Alexander froze at the sound of his name. For a heartbeat, he considered simply walking away, pretending he hadn't heard. But Thomas's expression had already confirmed Patricia Chen's suspicion. "Mr. Green," she said again, closer now. "I thought that was you. I interviewed you for the Arts Quarterly feature 3 years ago." Patricia Chen, she added, extending her hand. Around them, the station continued its normal rhythm, most people unaware of the small drama unfolding in their midst. The crowd around the piano had thinned as trains departed and new players took Alexander's place, though none drew the audience he had. "Ms. Chen," Alexander said, shaking her hand briefly. His voice had shifted subtly, taking on the polished tone he used for business interactions. "What an unexpected pleasure." Thomas stepped between them, already in damage control mode. "Ms. Chen, I'm sure you understand Mr. Green is in a hurry. Perhaps we could arrange a proper interview at a more convenient time." But Patricia's journalistic instincts were fully engaged now. "Were you playing incognito deliberately, Mr. Green? Is this something you do regularly? Your performance was remarkable. Certainly not what one would expect from someone who told me they had just enough training to know what real talent sounds like." Her questions hung in the air as Alexander considered his response. The truth seemed both too simple and too complex to explain, that he hadn't planned any of this, that he'd been drawn to the piano by some need he couldn't articulate, that the music had poured out of him like a confession. "It wasn't planned," he said finally. "I was just walking." She waited for him to continue, her reporter's patience outlasting his silence. "Sometimes I need to remember who I was before." His voice trailed off. "Before the money. Before the success. Before Elizabeth died. Before all of it." Understanding flickered in Patricia's eyes. "Before you became Alexander Green, the billionaire," she supplied. He nodded, relieved that she seemed to grasp what he was struggling to express. "Sir," Thomas interjected, checking his watch pointedly, "the board meeting has been rescheduled for noon. We really should go." Alexander felt a flare of irritation. "I canceled all my appointments today, Thomas." "Yes, sir. But the situation with the merger has escalated. Mr. Donovan is threatening to pull out if decisions aren't made immediately." The real world was intruding, its demands as insistent as ever. Alexander glanced back toward the piano, where a teenage boy was now playing something contemporary with more enthusiasm than skill. The magic of the earlier moment was fading, dissolving back into the ordinary bustle of the station. "May I walk with you?" Patricia asked. "Just to your car. I'd really like to understand what brought you here today." Before Thomas could object, Alexander nodded. "A short walk, then." As they moved through the station, Alexander was acutely aware of the contrast between his shabby disguise and the crisp professionalism of both Thomas and Patricia. Yet, oddly, he felt more himself in these worn clothes than he had in a tailored suit for years. "You play beautifully," Patricia said as they walked. "The Beethoven especially. I've rarely heard it performed with such emotion, even by professionals." "It was my wife's favorite," Alexander said simply. Patricia nodded, her expression softening. "I was sorry to hear about her passing. The obituary mentioned her work with children's health initiatives." They reached the main entrance of the station. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the sky remained heavy with clouds. A sleek black car waited at the curb, the driver standing at attention beside it. "Mr. Green," Patricia said, stopping at the threshold. "Would you be willing to give me an exclusive about this? Not the billionaire in disguise angle, though that's certainly interesting, but about the music, about what it means to you." Thomas made a small, disapproving noise beside them. "Ms. Chen, now is really not the time to—" "I'd like to think about it," Alexander interrupted, surprising both Thomas and himself. "The music is personal." Patricia handed him her card. "I understand. But I think your playing touched a lot of people today. That kind of genuine connection is rare." As Alexander took the card, the woman with the violin case approached, slightly breathless, as if she'd been searching the station for him. "There you are," she said. "I wanted to catch you before you left. That was really something back there." Alexander felt Thomas tense beside him, clearly concerned about another potential complication. "Thank you," Alexander said. "I'm a bit out of practice," the woman smiled. "Couldn't tell. I'm Nora, by the way. I teach at the city conservatory." She hesitated, then added, "We have a community program, free lessons for kids who can't afford them. We're always looking for volunteers to play at our fundraisers. Someone with your talent would be a big draw." She held out a brochure which Alexander accepted automatically. His mind was whirling now, overwhelmed by the morning's unexpected turns. "I'm not really a performer," he began. Nora raised an eyebrow. "Could have fooled me." And everyone else in that station? Just think about it, she said, already backing away. The contact info's all there. We could really use the help. Thomas checked his watch again more insistently. Sir, we really must go now. Alexander nodded, feeling suddenly tired. The emotional toll of the morning, combined with the physical exertion of playing after so long, had drained him. Thank you both for your interest, he said to Patricia and Nora, who stood side by side now, unlikely allies in their desire to pull him back into the world of music. I need some time to think. The car door opened and Alexander slid into the familiar leather interior, Thomas following behind. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, he watched the station recede through the window, already feeling the distance growing between himself and the man who had sat at that battered piano just an hour ago. Your clothes, sir, Thomas said, opening a compartment to reveal one of Alexander's usual suits freshly pressed. I took the liberty of bringing them. We can stop somewhere for you to change before the meeting. Alexander touched the soft, expensive fabric, then looked down at his worn jeans and sweater. These are fine for now, Thomas. Sir, the board can deal with me as I am today. The uncharacteristic firmness in his tone silenced his assistant. Thomas retreated into professional efficiency, tapping on his tablet to rearrange the day's schedule. Would you like me to brief you on the merger situation? Alexander turned back to the window, watching the city blur past. In a moment. I need to think. His mind was still in that station, still feeling the keys beneath his fingers, still hearing the applause of strangers who had connected with him solely through music. No knowledge of his wealth or influence had colored their reaction. It had been pure, authentic appreciation. When was the last time anyone had responded to him as just a person, not as Alexander Green, CEO of Green Technologies? Even his recent dates had been colored by his status, women who were interested in what he represented rather than who he was. He pulled out his phone and found himself scrolling through his contacts to a number he rarely used these days. Before he could reconsider, he pressed the call button. Hello? The voice on the other end was surprised. Alex, is everything okay? David, Alexander said, hearing the warmth in his own voice. His former piano teacher, now in his 80s, had remained a friend even as Alexander's visits had grown less frequent over the years. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I played today. There was a moment of silence, then a chuckle. About time. Your fingers getting rusty was a crime against music. Alexander smiled, remembering why he'd always appreciated David's blunt honesty. Rusty doesn't begin to describe it. But it felt right. Of course it did. It's who you are, Alex. Always has been. The car slowed as they approached the Green Technologies headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. Employees hurried in and out, none of them giving the car a second glance, accustomed to the CEO's comings and goings. I've been thinking about Elizabeth's foundation, Alexander said, an idea forming as he spoke. The children's music program she wanted to start before she got sick. I think it's time to make that happen. She'd be thrilled to hear that, David said, and not at all surprised. She always said the music would find its way back to you eventually. As the car pulled into the private garage beneath the building, Alexander felt a strange sense of clarity. The morning's unexpected detour had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. Thomas, he said as the car stopped, cancel the board meeting. His assistant looked up, startled. Sir, Mr. Donovan was very insistent that reschedule for tomorrow and get my foundation team in my office in an hour. We have a new project to discuss. Thomas hesitated, then nodded, already typing the changes into his tablet. Years of working for Alexander had taught him to recognize when his boss's mind was made up. As they rode the private elevator to the executive floor, Alexander felt the weight of his ordinary life settling back onto his shoulders. But something was different now. He carried the music with him, a reminder of the person he'd once been and might become again. The elevator doors opened onto the familiar, hushed luxury of his office suite. His assistant stepped out first, already calling instructions to the startled receptionist. Alexander remained in the elevator for a moment, thinking of the battered public piano in the train station, of the little girl in the yellow raincoat, of strangers brought together by unexpected beauty in an ordinary place. Sir? Thomas was waiting, holding the door. Alexander straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, still wearing his disguise. carrying a new purpose into his carefully constructed world. 3 months later, the same train station hummed with its usual morning activity. Commuters rushed to catch trains, visitors consulted maps, and the sound of announcements echoed through the vast space. But there was something different about the corner where the public piano stood. The battered old upright had been replaced by a gleaming baby grand, its polished black surface reflecting the station's lights. A small brass plaque on its side read, "Music connects us all. Please play. In memory of Elizabeth Green." Near the piano, a poster announced weekly concerts by students from the City Conservatory's community program. Today's performer was scheduled for noon, just 20 minutes from now. Alexander stood at a distance, watching people pass the piano. Some paused to admire it. Others trailed fingers across the keys before continuing on their way. He wore no disguise today, just a simple sweater and slacks, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. He looked like what he was, a man in his late 50s, comfortable in his own skin. "Are you nervous?" Nora asked, appearing at his side with a clipboard. Alexander smiled. "Terrified, actually." "Good," she said with a grin. "All the best performers are. Keeps you sharp." She checked her watch. "The students are ready. We've got about 15 kids here today." In the 3 months since that rainy morning at the piano, Alexander's life had undergone a transformation that still surprised him. The Elizabeth Green Foundation for Musical Education had been established with a $20 million endowment. Its first initiative was a partnership with Nora's conservatory program, providing instruments and lessons to children who couldn't afford them. The merger that had seemed so urgent that day had been completed without drama. Thomas had adapted to his boss's new priorities with his usual efficiency, though he still seemed baffled by Alexander's weekly teaching sessions at the conservatory. "Mr. Green." Patricia Chen approached, notepad in hand. "Right on time for your interview." The article she had written after their first meeting had been thoughtful and respectful, focusing on Alexander's passion for music rather than the novelty of a billionaire in disguise. They had developed an unlikely friendship, bound by a shared love of classical music and an appreciation for authenticity. "Let's do it after the concert," Alexander suggested. "I want to watch these kids play." As they spoke, a small crowd began to gather around the piano. Word had spread about the lunchtime concerts, drawing regular audiences of commuters, station workers, and music lovers. Among those approaching was the elderly man with the cane who had been at Alexander's impromptu performance months ago. He had become a fixture at these concerts, always occupying the same spot near the front. "Mr. Chen," Alexander greeted him. They had been properly introduced weeks ago. Raymond Chen, a retired music teacher who had once taught at Juilliard. "Good to see you again." "Wouldn't miss it," Raymond said, his eyes twinkling. "These young musicians keep me feeling alive." The crowd parted as a group of children approached the piano, led by their teachers. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, a diverse group united by their love of music. Some carried violins or flutes, while others would take turns at the piano. Alexander scanned the group and smiled when he spotted Lily, the little girl in the yellow raincoat. She was holding a small violin today, her face serious with concentration. Her mother stood nearby, catching Alexander's eye with a grateful nod. The first student stepped up to the piano, a 12-year-old boy whose family had immigrated from Venezuela the previous year. 3 months ago, he had never touched a piano. Today, he played a simple but beautiful rendition of a folk song from his homeland. As he finished, the crowd applauded warmly. Alexander remembered his own experience on this spot. The unexpected connection, the power of music to bridge differences and create community. One by one, the students performed. Some played with natural confidence, others with nervous determination, but each brought their own voice to the music. Alexander had worked with many of them, discovering in himself a talent for teaching that rivaled his business acumen. When Lily's turn came, she stepped up with her tiny violin. "This is for my mom," she said in a small but clear voice. Then she began to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the same song Alexander had played for her that rainy morning. Her technique was beginner level, but her joy in the music was unmistakable. Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he watched her. Elizabeth would have loved this. The children, the music, the simple human connection happening in this public space. For the first time in 3 years, Thinking of his wife brought more warmth than pain. When the students had finished, Nora stepped forward. And now, to conclude our concert, a special performance by our program's founder, Mr. Alexander Green. There was a smattering of applause as Alexander moved toward the piano. Some in the audience recognized him from his business life, others from his previous performance here, many not at all. It didn't matter. Today he was simply a musician about to play. He sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. Unlike that first day, there was no hesitation now, no rust to shake off. He had been practicing regularly, his technique improving with each week. "This piece," he said, looking out at the gathered faces, "is called Elizabeth's Song. I wrote it for my wife." The crowd fell silent as he began to play. The melody was simple but profound, weaving themes from Elizabeth's favorite pieces with original passages that spoke of their life together. It was neither technically brilliant nor innovative, but it was honest, the sound of one heart speaking to another across the divide of loss. As the piece built toward its conclusion, Alexander glanced up and saw Patricia wiping a tear from her eye. Raymond Chen was listening with his eyes closed, head tilted as if to catch every note. Nora stood with her arms around two of her youngest students, swaying slightly to the music, and there, at the edge of the crowd, Alexander spotted a familiar figure, Thomas, who had never attended one of these concerts before. His assistant gave him a small, affirming nod as if to say, "This is right. This is who you are." The final notes faded into the station's ambient noise. There was a moment of silence, then enthusiastic applause. Alexander stood, bowing slightly, then gestured to the students. "The real stars today are these young musicians," he said, "and their dedicated teachers. Please support their work if you can." He pointed to a donation box bearing the foundation's logo. As the crowd began to disperse, dropping bills and coins into the box, Alexander remained at the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys. Raymond approached, leaning on his cane. "You've found your way back," the old teacher said. "To music?" Alexander asked. Raymond shook his head. "To yourself." Later, as Alexander walked through the station toward the exit, he passed the spot where he had stood 3 months ago, a man in disguise, disconnected from himself and the world. The journey from there to here hadn't been simple or straight. There had been board members to convince, routines to change, priorities to re-examine. His phone buzzed. Probably Thomas, with some business matter requiring his attention. That world still existed, still needed him, but it no longer defined him completely. Outside, the day was bright and clear. No need for disguises now. He was neither just the billionaire nor just the pianist, but fully himself. A man reconnected to his passion, to his grief, to his joy, to other people. As he walked down the station steps, he began to hum a new melody, already taking shape in his mind. Behind him, from inside the station, came the sound of the piano, another person discovering the instrument, adding their music to the city's soundtrack. Alexander smiled and kept walking. The notes following him like old friends finally welcomed home.